I have written an article for Neo. It's long overdue. It's titled, Washington Sets Trap for Iran. Will Iran take the bait? We have watched one Israeli provocation after the other unfolding all across the Middle East. We see Israel citing October 7th, 2023, an attack Hamas launched against Israeli-held territory, Israeli civilians and military personnel. They're citing that as a pretext for their ongoing military operation in Gaza. I warned at the time that if they did not go in all out, as they have done previously, the operation would not be over in just a couple of months, and it would not be limited. If they decided to pace themselves, they would flatten Gaza, and that is exactly what they have done. They're doing this to provoke nations across the region. And you'd have to ask yourself, why? Why is Israel trying to provoke war with the entire region? Surely they don't think they can win this war or benefit from it, and you would be right in concluding that. But what Israel is doing in the Middle East is no different than what Ukraine is doing in Eastern Europe, or what the politically captured administration of Taiwan is doing against the rest of China, or what the Philippines is doing vis-a-vis China. These are politically captured entities used as proxies by the US to carry out belligerence the US itself cannot afford politically to at least openly do itself. They're trying to create an environment permissive for them to either intervene indirectly or directly to maintain primacy over the planet. And this is not speculation. This is stated US policy stretching all the way back to the end of the Cold War. This is a New York Times article dated 1992. US strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop. They are talking about American primacy, using sufficient military might to deter any nation or group of nations from challenging American primacy. The United States is not just doing that in Eastern Europe vis-a-vis Russia. It's not just doing it in the Asia-Pacific region vis-a-vis China. It's not just doing it in Latin America vis-a-vis nations like Venezuela. It's also interested in doing it in the Middle East. It's a very important region of the planet. The US certainly seeks to hold primacy over it as well. And if it has proxies in all of these other regions, surely it has a proxy in the Middle East. It is abundantly obvious that that proxy is Israel. The US has spent decades building it up. So that's what this article entails. The US, just as it baited Russia into a war in Ukraine, is trying to bait Iran and its allies into a major war in the Middle East, just as the US is trying to bait China into a conflict over either the Philippines and the South China Sea or Taiwan itself within China's own boundaries. Let me just start reading through this article. As I always do, I'll add information in if and when necessary, and I will show you the sources that I'm citing as I go through this article. So amid the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the growing tensions in the Asia-Pacific, Washington is moving forward an equally dangerous regional war in the Middle East between its Israeli proxies and a growing list of neighboring states and organizations. This includes Lebanon, the nation of Lebanon itself, and the Lebanese-based military and political organization Hezbollah. You have to remember, Hezbollah is a political organization as well as a military organization. That it has an administration. It administrates regions of Lebanon, has emergency services. They fix roads. They collect garbage. It's more than just a militant organization. And Western media rarely mentions that, but that's important to keep in mind. The list also includes the Syrian Arab Republic, Iran, as well as Shia militias across Iraq, and Yemeni-based Ansar Allah, which is referred to across the Western media as the Houthis. This large group of nations and organizations stretching across the region share a common denominator. They all serve as obstacles to U.S. primacy over the region, with the U.S. itself having waged war directly and or indirectly against each since the end of World War II. Some of these conflicts were inherited by the U.S. from the British Empire, and they had been going on before there ever even was an Israel. For people who imagine that Israel dictates U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, a lot of this stems back to before there even was an Israel. It's important to understand this. Just as the US has recruited Ukraine to wage war on Russia by proxy in Eastern Europe and has politically captured and used the island province of Taiwan against the rest of China in the Asia-Pacific region, I also have repeatedly mentioned the Philippines. The US has carefully cultivated Israel politically and militarily for decades to serve as a proxy used to carry out assassinations, terrorist attacks, military strikes, and even provoke wars the US itself seeks plausible deniability in regards to. This is stated US policy. You can find it in signed and dated policy papers, which I am going to go over. Toward this end, the US provides Israel with billions in aid annually, including a steady flow of arms and ammunition. Israel's various wars of aggression would be impossible to conduct without. While Washington publicly poses as seeking peace and stability in the Middle East, its continuous support for Israel enables the perpetual conflict and instability undermining the region. Most recently, the U.S. has repeatedly claimed to have urged Israeli restraint regarding its military operations against Gaza. We see U.S. President Joe Biden saying all the time about how he wishes Israel would show restraint and go to the table and talk peace with Hamas and the Palestinians. He's saying this to create plausible deniability for what is essentially a proxy war against Gaza, which is a means of escalating toward a regional war with Iran, which is longstanding U.S. foreign policy, regardless of who sits in the White House and regardless of who controls Congress. In practice, however, the U.S. has enabled the large-scale destruction of Gaza through the continual shipment of munitions, including thousands of bombs used in Israeli airstrikes, Reuters reported in June of this year. This isn't the only shipment of bombs the U.S. has sent Israel, but this is just one of many, and it's the headline says, exclusive, U.S. has sent Israel thousands of 2,000-pound bombs since October 7th. So the U.S. is fully enabling Israeli hostilities against Gaza. They can claim all they want, that they want Israel to show restraint, but they're enabling Israel to continue brutalizing the Palestinian people on the scale that they are brutalizing the Palestinian people, just as the U.S. repeatedly claims it wants Ukraine to show restraint. They don't want Ukraine to strike at Russian targets inside pre-2014 Russian borders, when we know for a fact that the U.S. is enabling all of these strikes that Ukraine is carrying out against Russia inside Russian territory. These drone strikes that are carried out on targets deep inside Russian territory could not be done without the U.S. enabling them. That is a fact. And even before Russia's 2022 special military operation, we remember many headlines like this. This is from a pro-Ukrainian media outlet. This was dated 2021, so a year before Russia began its military operations in Ukraine. And the headline says, U.S. urges Russia, Ukraine to return to Minsk dialogue. Minsk dialogue was a peace formula that was supposedly being used to avoid war between Russia and Ukraine's NATO sponsors. And in reality, even though the United States repeatedly called for peace, we know for a fact, because it was laid out in detail in U.S. policy papers like this Rand Corporation paper titled Extending Russia Competing from Advantageous Ground. We know that the entire conflict in Ukraine from 2014 onward was meant to bait Russia into a wider, more direct intervention, extend Russia as per the title of this paper, and hopefully precipitate a Soviet-style collapse afterward. So the U.S. is well versed at playing this game, pretending that it wants to be the peacemaker while being the primary factor undermining that peace. Despite both the U.S. and its Israeli proxies claiming Israeli actions are done in self-defense, the level of violence has been one-sided, with Gaza all but flattened and tens of thousands left dead, injured, or displaced. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions if you're talking about people who have been displaced. In parallel with its operations in Gaza, Israel has carried out strikes against Lebanon, Syria, and Iran, none of whom were involved in Hamas attacks in October last year. This is according to the Israeli military itself. How do we know that? Well, we have this article from The Guardian. No evidence yet of Iran link to Hamas attack, says Israeli military. So it is The Guardian, but they're citing the Israeli military. There were no signs that Iran or Syria or Lebanon or Hezbollah were involved with Hamas at all. As I've explained many times, Hamas has a very complicated relationship with the rest of the region. At one point, Hamas was fighting Hezbollah, Iranian-backed militias in Syria, the Syrian Arab army itself, and also Russian forces in Syria. Hamas is a compromised organization. It is a large and complex organization, but significant parts of it are compromised. It does not primarily receive support from Iran. It primarily receives support from America's Arab allies, including Qatar. So it's very important to understand this. The Western media and Western governments, including the US government, deliberately try to connect Hamas to Iran, to associate what Hamas does with Iran, when in fact, Iran has been working hard to make inroads to influence Hamas, to turn it around into an actual legitimate resistance organization, more like Hezbollah in Lebanon. And people say, Brian, that's not fair. You can't compare Hamas to Hezbollah. Hamas is trying to free occupied territory. The fact of the matter is, part of Hezbollah's story is that it did actually expel Israel from Lebanon. The fighters and the leadership that would eventually create what we know as Hezbollah today were fighting Israeli and US occupation of Lebanon for years, and they successfully expelled both. So that is the huge difference between Hezbollah and Hamas. One is a legitimate resistance organization. The other one poses as one. And it poses as one to attract legitimate resistance, but to neutralize it. This is what Israel and the US have been doing across the whole region for so long now. ISIS and Al-Qaeda are examples of this as well. And it's no coincidence that Hamas was fighting along ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria for years, until relatively recently. All three nations, so we're talking about Israel is claiming it's brutalizing Gaza in self-defense because of the October 7th Hamas attack. But the violence is one-sided. Yes, many people were killed during the October 7th attack. What Israel is doing to Gaza is disproportionate. Israel is also carrying out strikes against Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. Neither of these nations were involved in the October 7th attack, according to the Israeli military itself. All three of these nations have repeatedly resisted retaliating to these Israeli provocations. Now, there have been retaliations, but they've been very, very measured. I would say disproportionate, even to the point where many people are becoming frustrated. But let's talk about why they resist retaliating, because it is a trap and they refuse to fall into it. So let's talk about Israel and how Israel is the original Ukraine. Ukraine is like an Eastern European Israel. Taiwan is like Asia-Pacific Israel. It is a proxy the U.S. has built up, a forward operating base inside a region the U.S. seeks to control. The nature of Israeli belligerence is transparent, part of a well-documented U.S. policy to provoke wider war across the Middle East. The U.S. can then justify intervening in. And war, both the US and its Israeli proxies, can cite when using weapons and tactics otherwise difficult or impossible to justify, up to and including nuclear weapons. Remember that Israel has nuclear weapons. The US, we all know, obviously has nuclear weapons. Israel also has nuclear weapons. If the US wanted to use nuclear weapons but didn't want to take responsibility for doing so, it would use its one and only proxy in the world that has nuclear weapons. That is Israel. Iran is acutely aware of this reality. In 2009, the Brookings Institution, in its 170-page paper titled Which Path to Persia? Options for a New American Strategy Toward Iran, would detail various means to coerce, contain, and ultimately overthrow the government of Iran, including waging war against Iran. Iran is the largest obstacle to U.S. primacy over the Middle East, just like Russia, just like China and their respective regions of the world. The U.S. desperately wants to overthrow, divide, and destroy Iran. And that is what this whole paper is all about. It is available online for free. The link is in the video description below. It is 170 pages. It was written in 2009. Literally everything written in this paper has either been implemented or is in the process of being implemented. And you go down to the table of contents and you will see options very similar to all of the options we remember seeing in that 2019 Rand Corporation paper titled Extending Russia. It is the same plan, just custom tailored for each US adversary in each region of the world. Sanctions, subversion, terrorism, provoking war, waging war, invasion, and occupation. This is America's tool set, and this is what they use all around the globe. The paper admits how difficult it would be for the United States itself to launch military strikes against Iran. This is a quote from the paper. Any military operation against Iran will likely be very unpopular around the world and require the proper international context, both to ensure the logistical support the operation would require and to minimize the blowback from it. And we can see how complicated, how much more complicated American diplomacy is now than it was back in 2009. It also says it would be far more preferable if the United States could cite an Iranian provocation as justification for the airstrikes before launching them. Clearly, the more outrageous, the more deadly, and the more unprovoked the Iranian action, the better off the United States would be. Of course, it would be very difficult for the United States to goad Iran into such a provocation without the rest of the world recognizing this game, which would then undermine it. And they're talking about goading Iran because they admit all throughout the paper, Iran does not want war with the United States, or even with Israel for that matter, and that to wage war against Iran would require provoking Iran into war. That was the reality then in 2009. That is the reality today. This is why Iran does not retaliate. It is a big, rusty bear trap laid out in the middle of the room, and Iran sees it and it refuses to step in it, even if the world population is screaming for them to do so. They see it for what it actually is. An entire chapter was dedicated to the use of Israel to carry out an initial strike on Iran, allowing the US to distance itself from culpability. This is what the chapter is titled, Leave It to Bibi, which is a nickname for Benjamin Netanyahu, allowing or encouraging an Israeli military strike. This is what it says explicitly. The goal of this policy option would be to destroy key Iranian nuclear facilities in the hope that doing so would significantly delay Iran's acquisition of an indigenous nuclear weapons capability. However, in this case, an added element could be that the United States could encourage or perhaps even assist the Israelis in conducting the strikes themselves, in the expectation that both international criticism and Iranian retaliation would be deflected away from the United States and onto Israel. This is exactly how the United States is using Ukraine. This is exactly how the United States is using the administration in Taiwan and the politically captured administration in the Philippines. The paper notes that an Israeli strike could trigger a wider conflict between Israel and Iran that could draw the United States and other countries, including the United States, giving Washington the pretext it seeks ahead of any war of aggression it itself wages against Iran. So they admit that it would be the perfect way for the US itself to end up at war with Iran. And they can choose for themselves how directly or indirectly they involve themselves in the war, depending on the circumstances at the time. Using a proxy is the perfect option. That is why the US has proxies all around the globe, including in the Middle East. With this policy in mind, Israel's steady cadence of increasingly provocative attacks against Iran and its allies is easy to understand. The U.S., through Israeli provocation, seeks to provoke a wider war the U.S. itself can wade into, appearing to be aiding an ally rather than initiating yet another war of aggression in the Middle East. Remember, the Brookings paper, Which Path to Persia, was written in 2009. That was right at the height of all the consequences the U.S. was paying for its illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003, starting in 2003. All of the fallout was culminating right around this time. Ultimately, for this trap to work successfully, Iran must retaliate to one of these many provocations and do so in a way the US and its allies can portray as disproportionate or even unprovoked. You have to remember, the United States, the Western media, its Israeli proxies, again, try to spin Israeli military operations in Gaza as some sort of form of self-defense. So far, Iran's responses have been exceedingly measured. We remember Iran launching a missile strike at Israel directly. This was unprecedented, but they did so in a way where Israel, the United States, and others had prior warning and were able to react and defend against it. And they used weapons, and they picked targets that would minimize the damage to Israel. Now let's talk about short-term revenge versus long-term victory. Which is more important? Israeli assassinations, terrorist strikes, and even unilateral military strikes have been carried out against both Lebanon and Syria for years without seriously threatening the survival of either nation. That's true. When you really think about it, as provocative as these attacks are, what have they actually done to threaten the survival of these nations? Just keep that in mind. I mean, I know the arguments people are going to make. We'll get to that in just a moment. The US engineered proxy war that had actually been threatening Syria's survival was defeated through security cooperation within Syrian borders between Syrian forces, Russia, and Iran, not by attacking Israel, not by attacking Turkey, and not by attacking the United States. They worked together inside Syria to secure Syria and to mitigate the threat this proxy war posed to the survival of the Syrian nation state. Likewise, Iran has weathered direct and indirect attacks, including terrorism, political interference, and assassinations for years, without these hostilities seriously threatening the survival of Iran as a nation state. In other words, there's almost nothing Israel can do to Iran or Syria or Lebanon to endanger their survival unless they escalate toward wider war and Israel can somehow justify the use of nuclear weapons, or the US is brought in and significant military power is used against these countries. US sanctions and political interference aimed at undermining and destabilizing Iran have been carefully managed and so far overcome, not through retaliation against the US and its proxies, but through Iran's close cooperation with and participation in the emerging multipolar world, having joined BRICS earlier this year. And as a matter of fact, this is almost certainly what is prompting the United States, its Israeli proxies, to try to provoke a war with Iran sooner rather than later. They can see Iran escaping out from under this shadow of destabilization, sanctions, and proxy war that the US has imposed on them for decades now. They can see them escaping out from under it. They're running out of time. The entire region is changing and shaping in such a way that it's going to make this process of interference, coercion, and the ability for the US to exercise primacy over the region almost impossible. Iran knows this. They can see the time favors them. In a much wider sense, as the multipolar world grows in size and complexity, and as US-led international order wanes, Washington's ability to assert primacy anywhere in the world, including the Middle East, wanes with it. Because of this, Washington is racing against the clock to use what remains of its advantages in economic and military power to eliminate its adversaries before the global balance of power tips further to its disadvantage. Washington seeks war by proxy or otherwise with Iran sooner rather than later. Retaliation to emotionally satisfy a short-term desire for revenge by Iran or its allies to what are increasingly desperate provocations would only be playing into Washington's desire to trigger a wider, profoundly costlier war that could destroy the whole region. So instead of just flattening Gaza, we could be flattening cities all across the region. Instead of Lebanon being tormented and undermined, the entire region could be turned upside down if this all escalates to wider total war. Instead, security must be increased. Iran and its allies must continue building up their military capabilities as they likewise build up their economic and political power, both within their own borders and across the region. Many of the provocations carried out by Israel, including a recent terrorist attack on Lebanon involving electronic devices rigged with explosives and distributed across the country, are entirely predictable and preventable. That was entirely predictable and preventable. The U.S. has been compromising electronic devices in transit on the factory floor and in transit for over 10 years. Any nation, any organization that is perceived as an adversary by the United States and its proxies needs to be more careful about where they acquire electronic devices. Hezbollah was not careful. That's why this attack was possible, not because it was so clever and the US and its Israeli proxies are so powerful, but because of a complete lack of operational security on Hezbollah's behalf. If you can plug these holes in security, you will make these type of provocations more infrequent and more difficult and less effective. For every attempt by the US and its proxies to destabilize the Middle East, the region and its partners must double down on maintaining stability and avoid wider conflict. A combination of continued security and diplomatic efforts are required to ensure future provocations are less effective and more difficult to carry out. This is possible. This can be done. This can be done. Overcoming these provocations rather than reacting to them will give the Middle East, along with the rest of the world, the time required to continue this fundamental shift in the global balance of power away from US-led unipolarism toward a better multipolar world. But before this can happen, nations must avoid the trap set by the US meant to trigger a destructive war Washington seeks to bury multipolarism with. And this is the same story that I have been telling about the US in the Asia-Pacific region. They constantly accuse China of racing toward war by 2025 or 2027, when in reality it's the US racing towards war. They understand that relative to China, they are weaker year to year. They understand that at a certain point, the window of opportunity for them to conduct some sort of military operation and it having some kind of impact on China, that window is rapidly closing. If it hasn't closed already, they understand that this is the same case with Iran in the Middle East and Russia in Eurasia. And so they are rushing all of these wars, proxy wars, this strategy of encircling and containing Russia, China, and also Iran. And if you understand this and you understand the long-term, larger picture, you understand then why Iran refuses to retaliate. They understand exactly what this is. It is a trap, and they refuse to step in it. They understand that if things continue in the direction that they're going, Iran is going to win by default. They're playing out the clock. However satisfying as it would be to see Iran destroy cities in Israel with missiles, that is only going to lead to more death and destruction. It will collapse the entire region. So you have to ask yourself, what is it that you actually want? You want the people in the region to live in peace and prosperity, or do you just want revenge and you want to see Israel destroyed? If that's what you want to see, well, that is irrational, and that's why rational leadership in Iran refuses to do that. Although the trap is set not necessarily to trick Iran into falling into it, but to create significant pressure across the public, pushing upward to try to get them to react, retaliate in a way that the US and its proxies can then use to justify wider war. The US wants wider war. They want it all over the world. Destroying the emerging multipolar world is the only way it can compete against it. It cannot compete against it by building more, by being more constructive, more helpful than, say, China or Russia or increasingly India and other members of BRICS. They can only compete by creating chaos, by dividing nations against one another, dividing nations internally, and collapsing everything. And this is how empire has always ruled over the majority despite being a minority. And this is exactly the strategy the US is building on top of. For the time being, Iran can clearly see this and they are avoiding the trap. Now, some people and this isn't in the article, but these are just some additional thoughts that I had after writing the article. Some people will say, well, Russia fell into America's trap by invading Ukraine. This isn't comparable. Ukraine used to be part of Russia. It is right on Russia's border. NATO was expanding right up to Russia, and they had already compromised, politically captured Georgia, militarily built it up, and then set it loose on Russia. That was in 2008, the Russian-Georgian war that Russia won. And they realized that the US was going to repeat this in Ukraine if given the opportunity. This is why they reacted to it. So it's a completely different set of circumstances, politically, militarily, strategically. Something else important to understand is that Russia has a huge nuclear arsenal. They have military capabilities that Iran does not have. Iran waging total war against Israel, who is armed with nuclear weapons. It makes no sense for them to use the same strategy Russia used in Ukraine. So it's very important to zoom out and see the big picture and to see past our immediate emotional reaction to what Israel's doing. It's doing horrible, horrific things in Gaza. That attack on Lebanon, rigging electronic devices with explosives, was a craven terrorist attack. And it's meant to boil people's blood and cloud their judgment and cause them to miscalculate. And all throughout human history, human conflict, this has always been an ingredient of warfare. And the most successful military commanders and the most victorious nations are those who are able to see past that, to ignore their emotions, think strategically, think logically, think rationally, overcome the enemy despite their best attempts to provoke them. So let's keep an eye on this with all this information in mind. I will continue keeping an eye on it and all the other conflicts connected to this, including in Ukraine and the growing tensions in the Asia-Pacific region. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. Absolutely everything is published up on Telegram, including backups of all of my videos. Not only are my videos on YouTube, they're also all backed up on Rumble. So check them out there. In the video description are all of the links that I've referenced in this video, along with the article that I wrote and was reading, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip past them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare and you're just helping share my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.